Hey everybody, so today I just wanted to show you, we'll do like a little tool long traditional tattoo style rose. I'm just going to do it on a piece of scrap. There's also a link in the description to this actual pattern. It'll be a free download and yeah, we'll get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to properly case my leather. The first thing I like to do is tape the back side. So what that's going to do is it's going to ensure that while you're, wetting and tooling and forming your leather, it's not going to get all stretched out and warped. And, not everybody does this, but I do find it leaves for like a nice clean finish at the back. It also protects your backside from any sort of dye and anything like that you may end up putting into it afterwards. So just do that, give it a little trim there. And so this is just Herman Oak 3 to 4 ounce vegetable tan leather that I'm using, and the world's dullest knife apparently. Anyways, from there I just give it a little spray down. I know I've done this in the last couple videos. I just wanted to give like a little bit more of a detailed sort of shot at that. So here's what I like to do is once it stops absorbing like that, it starts to kind of sit on the surface, I'll take a glass slicker and I'll just press some of that water into the leather. So there's tons of videos out there about casing. I've tried tons of different ways, like some people just give it a quick squirt and kind of go for it. I prefer this method. I find it leaves for easier tooling. So once it gets to this point, what I'll do is I'll throw it upside down on my marble slab for a little bit, and that'll just allow the water to really get into the center of the leather. So you want it to soak about halfway down, and then you want to let it kind of dry to almost its original color before you actually start tooling. But in the meantime, I'll go over how we make our stencil. Okay, so while we wait for the leather to case for a little while, what I like to do is take that time to make my stencil. So I just use a plastic tracing film and go over it with a Sharpie. Pretty basic stuff. You can find this at art supply stores. I've seen it at leather suppliers before. I live a bit of a distance from Buckskin Leather in Nanaimo, and they generally have sheets of it. But like I said, any arts and crafts store should also have it. It's just a very thin plastic material. Some people also just go straight from paper to their leather. I just find this, because your leather's damp, sometimes if you go just through paper, it'll actually tear or wrinkle or get super distorted. But again, it's totally personal preference. As you sort of move and progress, you'll figure out what works best for you. And hopefully these little tips and tricks are just going to help you find your way there. But this is a pretty simple way to get it done. And from here too, I mean, feel free with this pattern, like get wild with it, add some more leaves, like add a little extra couple of roses somewhere. This is just a little basic for practice, and this is why I'm doing it on scrap as well too. Okay, so while we wait for the leather to get ready, I'm just going to go over some of the tools I use. This is a traditional swivel knife. The yoke's on a swivel. You hold it however is comfortable and you move your knife around the piece. Personally, and this is something I get tons of questions about, I use a yokeless swivel knife. So the blade itself, and don't do this at home, but is on a pivot. So it's much more like holding a pen. And as I've said, like on Instagram and past videos and stuff, I have pretty damaged hands from years of metal fabrication and stuff, so I find they fatigue quite quickly, but using this, I'm able to work a lot longer. Now, this just comes down to personal preference. You'll figure out what's comfortable and what works for you. And the set of tools I use are pretty basic. Like, I use an old modeling spoon. You can get these at pretty much any leather supplier. And just a couple of stamps for this rose. Like, I use 2 different sized heavy checked bevelers to go around the outside. And then for the interior sort of shading and lifting, I use, these are just like a very fine like vertical stripe. Again, just 2 different sizes, so you can kind of get around like the little tight corners with the small one and go for like a bigger stretch with the larger one, obviously. And then I use a striped pear shader to kind of bring out like the details in the petal, and just a little mall. And that's it. Pretty simple. You don't need 10,000 stamps, and let's get going. So once your leather has had time to sit, you can see it's very close to its original color, but not quite, but you're not pressing and seeing any water coming up. If it is, you gotta let it dry a little bit longer. And to trace the stencil, I just use a little stylus I made myself. It's like a little tungsten carbide from back in my welding days, and an old lead holder. Of course, you can use a scratch awl, you can use a ballpoint pen, it really doesn't matter. So you're just gonna trace out your pattern. You can tape this down if you'd like. Keep in mind though that if you put tape on the surface of your leather, it's gonna leave like kind of a weird little mark. And so we can see here, there is a little bit of water pushing up into the back of the pattern. So once I have this traced out, I'm going to actually let it sit to dry out a little bit longer before we start doing swivel cuts and tooling. Okay, so once you've finished tracing around, you're gonna remove your stencil, and if you feel the need to, you know, like add any lines, I usually keep my reference sort of like off to the side or whatever. If you feel the need to smooth out any lines, that's fine. You can go right ahead and use your stylus to do that. But I think we're pretty good here, and it's just, you're just getting a template for your swivel cuts. So whatever you need to do, that's totally cool. And like I said, I'm gonna let this dry out a little bit further, and then we'll get to cutting. So now, before we go ahead and start doing our swivel knife cuts, you want to make sure you're stropping your blade. You want it nice and clean and sharp. So you just pull away from yourself a few times, and you can see that's just all the debris and whatnot from previous work. So, as I've said before, it's wise to keep your knife nice and perpendicular. You want to be cutting about 1/3 of the way through, and you want to make sure that you're cutting consistently throughout the whole piece. And if you feel the need to turn your piece, I mean, go right ahead. I know some people like to really anchor theirs down, but I prefer the mobility. As you can see, you can just kind of like swiftly run through lines, and anywhere it's meeting up with another line, I go from both directions. So you're not cutting over top of this line in front. And you're just going to work around your entire piece and cut all of those lines. And don't worry if you've gone off of the lines that you laid down. Like I said, it's just a stencil, it's just a reference. Now is when you like really pay attention and make sure you're making the shapes you want to make. Usually I'll add a little extra curve here and there, or I'll just kind of like smooth out a line or whatever. And as you work and practice, you'll find you get a lot faster with this. But in the beginning, just take your time. Nobody's in a hurry here. And there you have it. All of your swivel knife cuts. Again, take your time. It's not a race. And make sure you're getting each and every one. There we go. And now we'll move on to the tooling aspect. So personally, I like to hold my maul in the palm of my hand. I know a lot of people hold sort of, you know, by the base of it or whatever. I find this way gives me a lot more control. And again, just with the wrists and hands that I have, it's quite helpful as far as avoiding fatigue. And so I tool very slowly. I'm very intentional with the way that I cross over the one previous, and I like to tap light and often. So I'd rather have to tap it down a few times versus going once way too deep. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go out the outside of the entire piece. Now, this leather is still too wet. So I'm going to give this a little bit of time and we're going to try again. So what's happening, and this is like a good little troubleshoot, is because it's too wet, you can kind of see it's just pushing the leather too far. You want it to just be like a nice, clean, crisp impression. So I'm going to give this some time and we'll come back to this. Okay, and we're back. So this is what happens. Sometimes you get a little too excited. As you can see, the leather is much drier. It's much lighter in color. And when you're stamping, see, it leaves a nice, crisp impression. It's not bunching or moving around too weird. So, you know, it's all, like I said, it's all about learning. It's all about practice. Myself, I've been doing this for 1.5 years, so I'm not an expert. I don't have all the answers. I will do my best to provide them if anyone has any questions, but a lot of it is just with any art form, it's all about practice, persistence. I also have a background in sculpture, so this lends a lot of the same sort of techniques as well too, because ultimately what you're doing here is you're sculpting your leather. So you're using your little stamps to push and manipulate and draw and pull. You're making a 3D picture out of a 2D piece of material, right? So keep that in mind. As you're pushing stuff down, you're not going to be able to push it back up. That's why I'm saying, like, I like to, if I'm a little bit shaky or unsure, I would rather do a couple little light taps than to go too far. And so, because this is a 3 to 4 ounce as well, it's a bit on the thinner side, so you don't want to go too deep or you're going to tear out at the back. A lot of people use a little bit thicker of a leather. I tend to go 4 to 5. Usually you get like a little bit better of a base, but with 3 to 4, it's like a really nice thickness for, you know, like a little card slip or something. So I'm just going to work around the outside. This is just building my outline. I like a heavy checked beveler. It's just the look that I'm after. It's pretty dramatic. It looks really cool once it's been antiqued. You know, like all the antique paste gets kind of down in those little holes and it really makes your image pop. And again, this is like a tattoo style rose. It's not so much, you know, like a formal rose that you'd see outside. So it's a little bit more bold. The lines are like a little bit darker, for lack of a better term. But anyways, just keep working, get around the outside there, and we'll move on to the next part. And so once I've gone around the outside, where this rose sort of sits over top of the leaf, I also like to throw the heavy check down. I find it just really brings out the actual rose itself, and it kind of pushes that leaf into the background a little bit. So I will repeat that on the other side. And like I said, like, just don't feel like you have to do this exactly the same. I would love to see some other iterations of it, like add a bunch of leaves, you know, throw some other roses in there. Just have some fun with it. This is just a base. And so once all the checking is done, what I like to do is just to kind of go and visually make sure I'm happy with the line that I've put down. And so like this is where it was like a little bit too wet before. I'll just go back in over top. And when you do this, you can kind of feel like the little check marks will register in with the ones previous. And so I like to make sure they're sitting nice and bold and you're not overlapping in a way that it's making for like weird little small ones, if that makes sense, hopefully. But yeah, feel like, be encouraged, like go over your stuff, you know, keep plugging away at it. Again, it's, you know, it's a it's a marathon, not a sprint. So take your time. There's no pressure. Just really enjoy what you're doing. And so from there, I'll move on to the sort of striped beveler. And what I like to do is I start on the outer leaves and I work my way into the middle. So what you're doing is you're pushing and sculpting these different little petals, sorry, I think I said leaves, to look like they're sort of sitting on top of each other. So the ones, obviously the larger ones along the outside, would be sitting towards the back. And so this little beveler that I use also acts as a little bit of a lifter. So I like to go really nice and slow with this one. I have struck it right through leather in the past. It happens. Sometimes if it does, I'll use a liner behind it when I'm building my piece, but because this is just scrap, you know, this is a good chance to really sort of get your feel. And that's the only reason I haven't included a wallet pattern or anything like that. I would just love to see you guys try out, you know, just a little scrap piece. You can, you know, hang it up on your wall, use it as like a reference to see where you are in, you know, 6 months to a year of practicing. I still find I'm still learning every single project. You know, you kind of spend some time with your stamps, figure out how different methods move your leather in different ways. And before you know it, it'll become pretty second nature. And so somewhere like this, there's quite a tight little curve in there. So that's when I'll switch to the thinner one. This might be a little bit too thin. I'm still working on building up a little bit of a tooling stamp collection. For now, it's fine. It works for me. Like I said, I've been doing this for a little while, so I haven't had any problems yet. But be mindful that with the smaller surface area, it's going to have the potential to punch through a lot easier. So just go nice and slow. Just little shallow taps. You know, you can always push your leather down further. You can't very easily push it back out. So just sort of take your time. It's better, you know, to have to do a couple hits than one that's gone too far. And so I just work around my rose in the way that I'm beveling towards the outer petal. And so you can see here it looks like this one's sort of sitting over top of it. Now it still looks a little bit weird, but what we're going to do later is we're going to go back with that pear shader, and that's when we sort of sculpt the actual petal. So one thing I find in tooling, usually I have this like halfway through I'm like, oh my goodness, what am I doing? This looks absolutely ridiculous. But as you build your texture and your sculpting up, it starts to take a bit more shape. So don't be discouraged if you hit a point and you're like, whoa, that looks like it's not going anywhere. It will. It's a long process, I find. And watch, sometimes the little sort of peak there can get kind of smushed around. So just go really slow and careful around those areas and make sure you're kind of setting it where you'd like it to stay. And you'll see as you sort of progress up towards the middle, things kind of start to take shape a little bit. So you can see it's kind of like those petals are resting over top of the ones beneath them. And usually this is the time when I start using the smaller beveler quite a bit more. And so I'm just doing little small taps, and I'm also kind of letting the weight of the beveler do all the work. I'm not pressing down with it. Just kind of lightly traveling over that line. Also, don't be worried if you make mistakes too. A lot of stuff gets hidden when you antique your project afterwards as well. It is a paste, so it kind of gets down into all of your little lines and crevices a fair bit. So if stuff's looking like a little bit weird here, like where there's pinch marks where I haven't gone over it a second time, I'll just kind of take a moment to do that too. And so you're kind of getting down into the center of your rose there. It's getting pretty close to being done. And so once I get sort of into this area here, I do like to sort of reverse the way that I'm going as well too, to kind of push that center down a little bit and give it a little more dimension. And as I'm moving my beveler along, I'm overlapping by about 50%. So with these little tiny bevelers, as you can see, it does take quite a bit longer to do a little stretch there. So I've actually beveled the opposite side here so that it looks like it's sort of being brought forward a bit. And there you have it. So from here, we'll move on to the pear shading and kind of shaping out the leaves a little bit. Okay, so the one tool I forgot to mention, I believe this is called a veiner. I like to use these just on the leaves, and just because I think they're like a kind of a fun texture. So I'll just kind of plant one corner in that middle line there and just kind of work my way up. Again, not totally necessary. You're gonna figure out what, like the kind of stuff that you want to do. I've also left these just plain before. Sometimes I'll just do like a little dot or whatever. That's just my own personal style. And you want to watch that you're not hitting the other leather as well. And again, like this one's a little too short, so I'll just kind of re-register here and just add a little bit on. Okay, and then, yeah, like I said, once in a while I'll just chuck a little circle or two in there. So it's like a little dewdrop or something. Okay, and then we go on to the pear shading. So this is one with like linear lines. You can also use ones, I know they come in checkered and smooth, but I like the linear ones just, again, with the way that the antique catches them. And so I just kind of move around and sculpt out a little bit of a petal. I'll use kind of the butt side towards the outer and just have some, like, experiment with it, have a little fun. You know, as you kind of move around, you can, you know, build up a little bit of a ridge there. You can choose to leave it the shape of the pear shader. I mean, that could be totally wrong. I don't know, but it works for me. And now you're going to kind of watch your little rose take some shape. The petals are going to start popping out. It's going to look far more three-dimensional. And this whole piece really doesn't take too long. Like I said, like, I don't know, give yourself an afternoon, play around with it, take some time. I do a lot of these, so this is kind of second nature for me. But I don't really use any sort of rhyme or reason as to how I position my pear shader aside from big side out. Once you kind of run into some of these little areas, it's totally cool to use the smaller side. But yeah, you just want to put some nice sort of ripples into your petal. And what it's also doing too is it's going to push it like over your beveling a little bit as well too, and that's great. That's what we want. We want some character, we want some structure to it. You know, we want to make it look like it's sitting on top of the leather. And so I'm just going to go around my entire rose with that pear shader. If you don't like the way it's looking, just add some more little divots and whatnot. Once in a while too though, like right here, I definitely flatten that spot down a lot more than I would have liked. So I'm just going to go in with my beveler and kind of push it back out a little bit. And so it lifts sort of back up. And you know, once you get sort of into these tight areas in more towards the center of the rose, that'll happen a bit more. So, you know, just go back in, do a little lifting. And when you're happy with it, I like to give it a little bit of a layer of neat's foot oil just to make sure it's not drying out when we're dyeing it. I'm going to be dyeing this one. I won't paint this week. So I'm just going to go grab all that stuff and we'll take it from there. But there you have it, your rose. And so what I also like to do too when I'm just about done is I give it a little spritz just to kind of like get the color all totally consistent and the same. And that way I can kind of see how it's going to look when it's all finished. Like I said, like I kind of hit it there. Whatever, that's not a big deal. You know, you can take your modeling spoon and very gently sort of coax that leather back flat. And so your modeling spoon's also nice because you can also use it to do some of the sculpting of the petals as well too. That's a little something I forgot to go over. I also just like to use it on the leaves a little bit. Give them a little bit more dimension. So once you're happy with your piece, I just use a brush and apply a little bit of neat's foot oil. I don't get too too crazy with it. You don't want it to be super thick. It's better to do a couple of really light coats versus one really heavy one, I've found personally. You don't want it like pooling and getting into your tooling. Or you could find you have a few issues sort of down the line. But just a nice light coat. I'll generally let it sit overnight so it really absorbs in, and if I have to do a second one or even a third, I've had to do on some projects where the leather was really dry, I will do that. For the sake of this video though, I'm just gonna heat this up a little bit, sort of essentially like hot stuff it, and then we can move on to dyeing it. So I just use a hairdryer. It's hot enough. And you want to make sure you move sort of in circles. You're not leaving it just in one spot. You don't want to sort of scorch it. And then for this one, like I said, I'm going to dye it. I'm not going to use paint. I have these little cups around that I use. They're quite handy. It's just like a little palette almost. So for the rose itself, I'm a huge fan of this light rose by Angelus. It's just a really snappy bright pink. And then for the leaves, I'm just going to use a little bit of this jade, also by Angelus. Just beautiful, beautiful dyes, really brilliant colors. I find the jade is quite dark, so what I will do, I'm going to move this so you can actually see what I'm doing, is I'll just add a little bit of alcohol to kind of cut that color back a little bit. And then I'll just use some paintbrushes. I just use these little cheap, I get a set of like, I think it's like 40 of them at Michael's for 15 bucks, like twice a year. They just last forever. They don't tend to shed a lot, which is really nice. And so I'll just start building that dye up. You're going to want to give it a little bit of a chance to dry and sort of flash out before you add more. Like it'll go on quite dark, but with leather dye, obviously you can build it up, but it's impossible to take it back. You can also, if you really want to get creative, you could do like a base dye, and then once that's all dry and set, you could even paint some of the details over top. I am going to keep this one quite basic, just in interest of the video, but yeah, it would be kind of cool to take like a little bit of a neon green and do a little dry brushing over there to sort of get a little bit more depth. And then here, we'll just sort of build up this light rose a bit. Again, this is going to get antiqued, so you don't have to be too careful. You know, you want a little bit of character to it too, so I like to just kind of move around sort of randomly, do some spots over and over so they're going to get a little bit heavier. Just kind of build your color up. I mean, you also don't even need to dye that. You can dye this whole thing one color and antique over that. The sky is the limit. And I have found that the layer of Neat's foot oil helps the dye, and I've read this in forums too. I still use leatherworker.net quite a lot. It's just a really great resource for some tips and tricks. So a lot of the posts are a little bit older, but it's great. It really has helped me learn a lot. And so the dye just kind of helps, or sorry, the oil helps distribute the dye a little bit more evenly, and like I said, helps it to not dry out. This is an alcohol-based dye, so if you were to go straight to this, you would find your leather would dry out quite a bit. Okay, so now that everything's nice and dry, I take Angelus High Gloss Acrylic Finisher. You can also use acrylic Resin. You can use, I think there's like EcoFlow, whatever. There's a ton of different clear coats on the market. This is just the one that I have found that I like to use. And so I just do a pretty liberal coat over the entire project, and because I cut it 1-to-1 with water, it spreads out nice and evenly. It gets down into the leather, into all the tooling, which is what you want before you start antiquing. And so I'll usually have like a little paper towel handy just to kind of dry my brush off a bit. But don't worry, the bubbles and whatnot are kind of self-leveling. You don't want to brush this clear coat too much because it'll start to dry. And then you'll get little streaks. So anywhere that's kind of pooled or anything, I just use a little paper towel and just kind of soak it back up with the brush. I then let it dry, do a second coat, and then we'll be ready for antiquing. Okay, so now that it's all dry and had time to cure, I'm just going to use some Beveling's antique finish. This is just the black. You can, if you watch my last video, you can see how you can actually make your own colors too, using the neutral and a little bit of paint. And then I just like to use either like an old toothbrush or a paintbrush. And you can be very liberal with this. Any that you put on your piece that you don't need, you can just scrape off and throw back into the jar and totally reuse it. It's totally fine. So that's what I'll usually do here once it's all nice and covered and worked in. And this is why it's important to make sure your clear coat's really set, or you're going to end up getting into all those pores. So once that's done, just give it a little rub. And again, it's called antique, right? So you are going to get a little bit of discoloration, but not a ton if you've let your clear coat set properly. And so I get all the excess off first, and then I would let it cure again, maybe, you know, for a couple hours or whatever, until it's totally dry, and then I'll just give it another buff and another little bit of clear coat, and that's it. And then if you're sewing it into a wallet or a keychain or what have you, that's when you would go ahead and do that. But for now, this is just a little scrap project. I appreciate everybody joining in this week, and please let me know what you think. If you like this, we'll do more. If you have some suggestions, like somebody had said last week they want to see a skull, which maybe will be what I do next. And yeah, we'll just keep this rolling. But again, thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next one.